All right, hello everybody. Today I went through and watched a video by Brandon Sanderson from about 4 years ago. It's targeted, it says five tips for writing your first novel, but as I watched the video, it's actually more targeted as writing your first novel fast. It was posted, I think November, about 4 years ago, for the November novel writing November thingamajig that people do. And so even though the video is titled that it's for tips for your first novel, it's actually more about writing a novel quickly. But still, there are some good bits of advice here, and let's see what we can do here. So, also I'll put a link to the video in the description. So, his first tip is to borrow your structure from somewhere else. The way that he describes it is that what you do is you say, hey, I like this subgenre. And, it's got to be pretty narrow, but you say, what is, you cover a bunch of elements of pieces that are written in this subgenre, and you say, what are the hallmarks of this genre? What is typically present in a book like this? And then what you do is you boil down those necessary elements, or super common elements, and you use that to give yourself a scaffolding that you can then build your own characters and your own plot elements onto. He also mentions that you can do something like transposing the genre, is what he calls it, where you take a common structure from one subgenre and you move it to something else. An example would be, the example he gives is like taking an adventure, a romance substructure, and turning it into a western. So, question number one: did I do this? Somewhat, yes. I mean, the story that I'm writing right now, a novel that I'm getting ready to publish, has a structure that is kind of similar to other rescue stories by virtue of what has to happen in order for people who have been captured to get rescued. We have, our hook to start the story out. We have, the people getting, captured. We have the plan, the planning aspect of like, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to find these people? They're out in the middle of nowhere. We don't really know exactly where they are. How are we going to look for them? We have a series of clues and a series of hurdles that the characters have to overcome in order to, achieve their mission, to complete the job. And then there's a, climactic confrontation, and then falling action and kind of a review of what happened, and, letting the characters kind of breathe a little bit after the action. And, I did kind of transpose the genre a little bit too, because there's a little bit of detective novel kind of feel to some of the stuff in here. I've done that in other stories as well. I kind of like mixing, not like straight detective work, like not a whodunit necessarily, but like adding those mystery elements to science fiction, I feel, is a really good mixture. Maybe I'm overstating what I'm doing, but it sounds like I kind of sort of did this tip number one, which is, it's one of those things where Sanderson is an extremely successful author, and I am an extremely unsuccessful author, so far at least. And so it's not even an apples to oranges comparison, it's more like an apples to like the proverbial Charlie Brown rock comparison, right? So, for what it's worth, my opinions should be taken with a large grain of salt. Number two of Sanderson's tips: begin with a monologue. And then you don't necessarily have to use the monologue in the story, but what you can do is you can turn it into like little quotables for like the starts of chapters, or it can help you to write the story if you're writing in journal form. Did I do this? Not really. I kind of find epigraphs at chapter starts to be a little bit haughty. It's one of those things where it's like, it can be a teaser, but it can also be like, look at how great my world building is, and if it's not really good, then it's like, it kind of falls flat. But even so, even if I were to write something for epigraphs for chapter starts that I thought was really good, it wouldn't really fit in with the setting or the characters very well. This is not a story about some kind of like epic character arc. This is a story about some professionals who get a job and have to do this job and have to deal with the problems and the difficulties that the other side throws in their way. It's not about some hero's journey necessarily. There's not necessarily going to be a lot of character growth, although there is a little bit. It's more like a detective story in that sense too, where the detective character doesn't grow a lot from every mystery. He's going to solve a bunch of mysteries, and he's not going to be like an idiot starting out and like learn to be a detective over the course of many books. He's going to solve the first mystery, and it's going to be a good mystery. And maybe he meets a new character or learns something about himself, but he's not going through this like extensive, crazy arc. Like we'll get back into that a little bit later. What I did do that is similar to beginning with a monologue or turning it into epigraphs for characters for chapter starts is that I drew from other stories with the same characters, with the same central cast, and tried to build on those stories a little bit. That's kind of the Rex Stout method, right? You don't learn everything about Fritz in book 1. You learn a little bit about Fritz in book 1, and then a little bit more in book 2, and then a little more in 3 and 4, 5, 6. And by the time you've read 10 Nero Wolfe novels, you have a pretty solid idea of what Fritz is like, and nothing contradicts what you're learning, basically. Moving on to number 3. Sanderson says, think about what a character wants and what a character needs, how these two things are different, and why they can't have either of them. Now, his goal here, he says, is to make your story more character-centered and to make sure that your central character is the most interesting one. Did I do this? Not really. This is, again, where we're getting to apples versus the Charlie Brown rock. Maybe I should have? I don't know. The way that I've been writing these stories is I've been kind of focusing on this one main character, Eric Misevelin, who runs this salvage business. He is kind of the central organizer who gets the job, determines whether it's the job that they should take, whether they need to determine who do a background check on the supposed, person trying to hire them, things like that. And he has a series of connections that he uses to fulfill these jobs, to complete them. Be it his employees, or be it people that he knows that he can hire as contractors to help out with the job, things like that. The story that I'm writing is really more plot-centric, more like a standalone episode of a TV show than some character-centric story where there's some kind of epic arc. It's about developed professionals solving a professional problem for professional reasons. And so it's not about some character who, was an orphan, but turns out to be the chosen one, and there's some kind of massive, amazing thing that they end up doing. I find that these stories are too dependent on, like, rare and unlikely things. Like, if you've got a new chosen one showing up every year, and, going through this arc and overturning the whole kingdom or the whole social order or whatever, you kind of create a world that doesn't seem stable. You create a world that had 1,000 years of this, and then bam, and then 1,000 years of this other thing, or maybe it's bam, 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 bam after that. Either way, this just isn't the way that history works most of the time. A lot of these big changes take time, and while there are crystallizing events that do turn them over from one state to another, there's often a lot of like small events that lead up to the crystallization. And like for the purposes of story where you're doing like a professional doing on a rescue job for a salvage operation for some starship, they're not going to overturn the whole world order. They're going to try to get the team together that they think is going to be most effective. They're going to try to find as many clues and interpret them as correctly as possible. They're going to try to, prevent the antagonists from figuring out what their plans are. They're going to try to be careful and be cautious and be stealthy. They're not going to learn a new thing about, their lives for the most part. They might make a friend based on someone that they hired or something like that. But like, I don't know. Something about these stories where like there's these massive arcs always turns me off a little bit. I much prefer stories where, a person who is already, got his place does something cool with it. They're more self-contained, and they're less indicative of like some kind of like world where everything is constantly in this massive flux. or where one character suddenly takes a world that is in a stable state and subjects it to a massive flux. Because most of the time that stuff is way too shallow in some sense, where it's like, we overturned the empire, but like, you aren't really handling all of the little details in a way that is satisfying. Yeah, I mean, sure, you blew up the Death Star, but what happens to all the star systems that are still under Empire rule, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, you know, I'm not going to say that the original Star Wars trilogy does a bad job of this necessarily, but for like a novel version of that, if you were going to do something like that, you'd probably want more, you know, side stories, more of a look at, you know, what actually happened to the people that were on the Death. Well, I mean, we know what happened to the people that were on the Death Star, but what happened to their families, kind of thing, maybe, or you know, what happened to the worlds that were kind of grudgingly accepting Empire rule, things like that. I like it when there's not a massive like structure change in the world, because those kinds of things are so rare that, like, if you try to write a series of books about a series of these, you either need to spread them out by 1,000 years each, or, you know, you need to, you end up creating this world that is obviously, you know, terrible for the average person, because every year there's a new hero coming out and overturning everything that they built their lives upon, and they just kind of go by the wayside. It's one of those things that kind of annoys me about some stories. Not to say that it can't be done well, but, you know, it is something where if authors rely on it too much, you end up with this schizophrenic universe that's constantly flipping back and forth between all kinds of crazy states, and everything's happening, you know, in such a way that, like, no real person who's in that situation would be like, I'm happy with this, because everything is getting overturned, everything they care about is getting changed every couple of years, kind of thing. So for this number 3 about, like, really character centering things, I did not really do that so much. Maybe I should have. Maybe if I were writing a different story, I should take this advice. It's, you know, if I were trying to write a character-centered story, that would be definitely more of the thing to do. I think this is good advice if you're trying to write a character arc story. But since that wasn't really my goal, I didn't really follow this one. Number 4, choose your type of progress. He has this structure where he says there's a promise, then there's progress, and then there's a payoff, right? And he says that there can be different methods for that progress to appear. For instance, if your characters are going on a journey, their progress can be their progress on a map, right? You can say they were here, then they were here, then they were here, and then they ended up here, and this over here is the payoff. Similarly, if you're dealing with more like of a mystery structure, then you have progress in the form of clues. Okay, we learned this. What does this tell us? How do we utilize this clue? How do we use this clue? What happens when we try to do this with this clue? Do we get something good out of it? Do we get something bad out of it? Does it push us forward? Does it pull us back? Did I do this? Yes, absolutely. My story, the novel that I'm currently finishing up, is definitely structured as a set of clues and problems to be solved. And these problems are both long-term-ish problems and immediate problems. For instance, the very start of the story is basically these characters get a phone call, and they're like, and it's a phone call from the local space station, and they're like saying, "Hey, you know, we got on our sensors something very strange a little while ago. It was a lifeboat shuttle, and apparently there's nobody on it. But it came in, and it came in via shelf space, which is uncommon as well for lifeboats to have that technology equipped on them. And so, you know, we thought we'd hire you to look into this." And so they go and they figure out how they're going to examine this. They check out the shuttle. They learn a little bit about what they think might have happened. And then they say, okay, this is the information that we have. How do we use it to get to the next step in solving this problem? You know, so they say, well, we can calculate the trajectory of this. We can look at these records on the computer that say that it was doing this for so long, yada, yada, yada. We can look at how much fuel was left, things like that. Later on, they have another problem where they want to follow a trail of clues, but they have to get something out of the way first. And so they have this long-term goal, but before they can complete this long-term goal, they have to complete a short-term goal first. They have to make some necessary repairs on some things and move something to a place where it's less likely to be found by bad people hunting for it. So yeah, I definitely have a lot of clues and a lot of problems to solve. I have problems with different like length outlooks. I have clues, some clues that, provide good information, some clues that provide mediocre information. I have them using the clues in ways that they think are going to be the most possibly successful, but sometimes they aren't successful anyway, kind of thing. There's a lot of that, and the purpose of that all is to kind of keep things interesting and keep things from being overly predictable. I mean, the thing about predictability, right, is that for any given story, let's say that a story is read by 1 million people or observed by 1 million people. There's going to be people in that million who probably guess the correct series of events. But the question is that 1% or 10% or 90%? You want to keep things, at least my perspective on this is that you want to keep things so that, most of the people can predict the ultimate ending. Like they say, I think they're going to make it. I think they're going to do it. And kind of in broad terms. But what what people don't predict is, which characters are going to be most instrumental in the success of the story. Are any characters going to be injured or killed or not? That stuff should be relatively unpredictable, right? If you have 12 characters in the story and one of them dies, it might, the number of people that predict that it was this character who died, should be somewhere between, 1 in 12 or maybe a little bit more than that, because there could be characters in different positions where it's like, well, this character is more vulnerable. But like having the red shirt is generally a bad idea because people, by this point, they're trained to look for it, and it can kick you out of your immersion. What you do is you create a bunch of, or what I did was I created a bunch of, characters who are, of similar but slightly varying expertises, and I have them all attack this particular problem. And, some of them come out all right, some of them do not, and, it's not about, you could say that, well, the mercenaries who hired are probably the first, they're going to be the tip of the spear. So, one of them is more likely than my main characters to kick the bucket, but, you don't know whether they're going to or not. And certainly they as intelligent people, they take the, as much, as many actions as they can to minimize their own, the danger to themselves as well. It's one of those things where it's hard to write, or it's not that it's hard. It's that it's more time consuming. It's more time consuming to write a bunch of intelligent characters doing intelligent things and still end up in a situation where some of them just don't make it. Because what a lazy writer will do is he will say, oh, well, this character just made this mistake and that gets them killed. But usually that's not very satisfying to a reader, especially if they liked that character and it's like all of a sudden this character's like, well, I'm going to go off by myself. Tell me if you guys see the slasher. Let me know. And doing that is a good way to kick people out of their immersion in the story. And kicking people out of their immersion is a great way to get people to say, oh, I can put this down. Maybe put a bookmark in, maybe not, who knows, right? So like this kind of structuring, taking the time to like say, okay, this character is knowledgeable of this. Since they're knowledgeable of this, what would they add to this discussion? What would they, if you told them that this was the danger that they were working toward or walking into, what would they do to prevent that danger from taking care of them, right? If they know they're getting into a gunfight, well, they're going to put on a bullet-resistant vest. They're going to make sure that they also have a gun. Maybe they're going to differ in the quality of their skills, using the gun or whatever, but they're all going to at least have them and say, well, and even if they don't like it, they'll be like, well, I might need it, so, I'll probably have it along just in case. So, like, that's kind of the takeaway from rule number 4 here, is that not only do you have this promise, progress, payoff structure for dealing with how you progress through the story, but you also need to slow down when you're writing and take your time to ensure that you're not taking these shortcuts for progress as well. Sometimes progress takes time, and sometimes thinking about the different things an intelligent character would choose or not choose to do to deal with a specific situation takes time. And this is another thing that I'm going to get to in a minute, but like, brainstorming feels lazy. This is one of these things that I've learned, is that brainstorming feels lazy, but it isn't. You can sit down and you can just sit there in an empty room and think about your story, and it feels like you're not doing anything. But, if what happens after an hour of that is you write down 3 sentences on a piece of paper that really help to solidify things in your story, or really help to move it forward, or really help to give a character that little extra kick of interestingness that makes them fun to read about, then it's actually worth it. That's the point about point number 5 that doesn't work for me. And he does say, if some of these tips don't work for you, go ahead and abandon them. But I'm going to explain tip number 5 here, because what he says is prime your mind by doing something else, by thinking about your writing while you're doing something else. Think about while you're doing your chores, or while you're commuting, or something that requires your physical attention but not your mental attention. Music, listening to music to match the tone of the scene you're planning to write. Did I do this? Only slightly. I definitely primed my mind by looking at my outlines and by looking at my character descriptions, but I am very bad at multitasking creatively that way. Generally speaking, even if I'm doing like chores or something like that, I find it hard to draw my mind completely away from that in such a way that I can not have my attention be on the work that I'm trying to get done, whatever it be, dishes, laundry, whatever. I have this tendency to just focus on what I'm doing. Even like a commute. If I'm driving, I'm thinking about the gears, I'm thinking about the wheel, I'm thinking about, is my car making a funny sound while I'm driving? And so oftentimes I feel that I can't bring my mind away from what I'm doing to that extent. It doesn't give me very good results, and I just feel like it's wasted time. However, one thing that I will do is I will just remove all distractions. I will put a timer on, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe I'll just let it be an definite period of time. And I will just sit with a blank sheet of paper, or a stack of blank sheets of paper, and I will just write down, I'll just sit and think. And if I come up with anything, I'll write it down. And you can do this for practically anything that you're planning to do that, requires a little bit of prep work, right? You can use it to prepare the plot for a story. You can use it to do character outlines. I very much prefer to sit without distractions and focus on the brainstorming rather than trying to idle-mindedly brainstorm while I do something else. It just doesn't work for me. It does feel lazy. Like, it feels not just lazy, but boring, right? Like, this is why you have to get rid of distractions, because if I decide I'm going to sit down and brainstorm, it is much easier for me to turn on a YouTube video or a television show or a video game and just do that and not actually brainstorm. But if I sit in my office with nothing in front of me but a bunch of blank sheets of paper and just no sound, no distractions, no interruptions, and just sit here and write whatever comes to mind, and just let it roll in my head as much as it needs to, that works better for me than trying to think about something while I'm doing something else. You might find that you have the opposite response, but I tend to not be much of a multitasker. So that is what I've got for you for today. Again, I will put the link to this video in the description so that you can go check out Sanderson's video for yourself if you like. Again, I think that all these tips are pretty good. Some Sanderson himself admits that they're more geared towards someone trying to write a book quickly. This is for a novel November thing, right? Where you're supposed to try to write 50,000 words in November. But the title of the video is about first novel, which is what I went by when I watched it to make this video for you guys. So most of his advice is good. I would say that writing these character-centered stories is something that you either do or don't do. But the advice is very good if you're trying to do that, if that makes sense. If you're trying to write a plot-centered story where the characters aren't going through these arcs, then you can certainly learn a little bit from his step 3 or from his tip number 3, but you're not going to want to necessarily worry too much about like coming up with these complicated arcs for a story about like a police procedural, right? Something like that. So, yeah. Good tips. I'll go through them one more time. Borrow your structure. Begin with the monologue. You don't necessarily have to use it, but you can use it to help develop your concept of a main character. Think about what your character wants and needs, how they're different, and why they can't have them. Choose your type of progress and make sure to pepper it throughout the story. And number 5 is prime your mind. Think about your story when you're not writing, before you start writing. Again, I used them to varying degrees while I was writing this novel. I was a little surprised because I was expecting to be like, no, I didn't do this, no, I didn't do this, no, I didn't do this. But like 4 of the 5 are definite yeses, and the third one is kind of, sort of, right? So anyway, that's what I got for today. Hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in video game stuff, on Monday, I think I'm going to be doing my kind of like conclusion video of my Dark Souls Skeptic or Soulsborne Skeptic series. Maybe not conclusion, but like kind of like the semi-conclusion, because I haven't finished. Well, I'll talk about it on Monday. Anyway, have a good weekend, and I will see you all next time.